The warship hung in space like a predator watching prey, and Fleet Commander Junho stood on his bridge with his hands clasped behind his back and his face carved from stone. He had his orders and they were clear, and he had never disobeyed an order in 30 years of military service. But something about this situation made his fur bristle with unease. The transport ship full of infected cubs was a threat to every Veltharan world, and galactic protocols demanded its immediate destruction. But there was a human medical frigate positioned directly between his weapons and the target. Junho's tactical officer reported that the human ship was not moving and was broadcasting on all channels that they would not withdraw, and the commander felt his jaw tighten in frustration. Humans were supposed to be reasonable and practical, but this Captain Minho was acting like a fool willing to start an interstellar war over a doomed rescue mission. The tactical officer asked if they should target the human ship as well, and Junho was about to give the order when his communication officer interrupted with an urgent message. Multiple civilian Veltharan ships were approaching the area, and they were broadcasting medical credentials and demanding access to the transport. Junho pulled up the identification codes and felt his blood run cold when he saw that these were not military vessels but private doctors and nurses and medical volunteers who had somehow learned about the quarantine situation. His political officer was already explaining that underground communication networks had been spreading the story, and there was public outrage that the military was preparing to kill cubs without even attempting a rescue. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Junho needed to make a decision quickly before this turned into a complete disaster. He ordered his weapons officer to hold fire and opened a channel to Captain Minho and demanded to know what the human thought he was accomplishing by interfering with Veltharan military operations. Minho's face appeared on the screen, and the human looked tired but determined, and he said he was protecting his medic, who was currently saving the lives that Junho had already written off as acceptable losses. Junho bristled at the accusation and said the infection was too dangerous and proper protocols must be followed, and Minho cut him off by saying that proper protocols apparently meant murdering children. The human captain's next words made Junho's ears flatten in shock, because Minho said he had launched media drones that were recording everything and transmitting it in real time to news networks across multiple species territories. The entire galaxy was now watching to see if the proud and honorable Veltharan would really fire on their own cubs and the human trying to save them. The political officer made a strangled sound and immediately began pulling up news feeds, and Junho saw with growing horror that the story was already spreading like fire. Images of the transport ship and the human frigate standing between it and the warship were being broadcast with commentary about honor and compassion and the value of life. His own people were flooding communication channels demanding that he stand down, and there were protests forming on 3 Veltharan worlds, and this was becoming a catastrophe that would define his entire career. Junho closed his eyes briefly and tried to think like a military commander, instead of like someone whose hands were being forced by public opinion. The infection was real and dangerous, and if it spread beyond the transport ship, it could kill millions. But the human doctor had been on that ship for almost a day, and perhaps she had found a way to contain or treat it. He asked Minho what the status was of the cubs and the human medic, and Minho's expression became grim as he said Jiwan was in critical condition from blood loss, but the cubs were responding to treatment. Something about hearing that the human had nearly killed herself trying to save Veltharan children made Junho feel a sharp twist of shame in his chest. He asked what kind of treatment, and Minho explained about the plasma transfusions and the boosted immune response, and how Jiwan had figured out that this was not a contagious plague, but rather a parasitic infection that could be managed. Junho's medical officer was already running the numbers and confirmed that if this analysis was correct, then the threat level was significantly lower than initially assessed. The civilian medical ships were now within communication range, and their lead doctor was broadcasting that they had the proper equipment and supplies to treat the cubs, and asking for permission to dock with the transport. Junho found himself at a crossroads between military discipline and moral responsibility, and the entire galaxy was watching to see which path he would choose. His tactical officer reminded him quietly that he still had his orders, and the transport should be destroyed. But Junho noticed that the officer's voice lacked conviction. He made his decision and opened channels to both the civilian ships and Captain Minho and said that he was suspending the termination order pending a full medical assessment. The civilian ships could dock and provide aid, but if there was any sign that the infection was spreading beyond the transport, then he would destroy everything without hesitation. Minho nodded acceptance of these terms, and the civilian doctors were already moving toward the transport with their equipment and supplies. Juno watched on his screens as the rescue operation unfolded and medical teams boarded the transport and began treating cubs with proper Veltherin-specific medicine and bringing in blood plasma from compatible donors. Reports started coming back that the human doctor had been found unconscious with dangerous blood loss, but stable vital signs, and she was being transferred to one of the civilian medical ships for emergency care. The cubs were responding well to treatment and projected survival rates were climbing above 90%. The political officer was tracking public opinion and reported that the outrage was shifting to celebration and Junho was being called everything from a coward to a monster, depending on which network you watched. He found he did not care much about his reputation anymore, because he was too busy thinking about the fact that one human had been willing to die for children that were not even her species, while he had been ready to destroy them all for the sake of following orders. Days passed and the crisis resolved itself with most of the cubs making full recoveries and being reunited with extended family members who came from across Veltharan space to claim them. The human doctor named Jiwan spent 5 days in intensive care before she finally woke up, and Junho found himself curious about what kind of person would do what she had done. He reviewed her service record and saw that she had a pattern of refusing to give up on patients and putting herself in danger to save others, and there were multiple commendations mixed with reprimands for insubordination. The media attention grew more intense, and suddenly this was not just a story about a quarantine ship, but about what it meant to value life and whether protocols and rules were more important than compassion. Human-Veltharan relations began to shift in ways that diplomats had been unable to achieve in decades, because one person had acted like children mattered regardless of politics. Junho received orders to return to the Veltharan homeworld where he would face an inquiry into his handling of the situation. He arrived to find protests both supporting and condemning his actions, and the inquiry board was made up of military officials who looked at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to understanding. They reviewed everything he had done and asked why he had allowed public opinion to influence a military operation, and Junho said simply that he had realized destroying the cubs would have been the wrong choice regardless of what the protocol said. The board dismissed him without making a final decision and told him to wait for their judgment. While he waited, Junho watched more news coverage and saw interviews with cubs who had survived, and they all spoke about the strange mother who had refused to leave them. Hyunwoo appeared on camera and spoke with the clarity of someone older than his years about how Jiwon had taken off her helmet, knowing she would get sick, and how she had given her own blood until she collapsed. Sora sat next to him holding a drawing she had made of a human figure surrounded by small Veltharan cubs, and she said she wanted to be a doctor like Jiwon when she grew up. The inquiry board finally called Junho back and he stood at attention while they delivered their judgment. They said his actions had been technically a violation of orders, but that circumstances had warranted flexibility, and the outcome had prevented a much larger catastrophe. He was being retired from active service effective immediately, but would retain his rank and honors, and they strongly suggested he consider a position in diplomatic relations where his newfound appreciation for nuance might be useful. Junho accepted the judgment without argument because he knew he had gotten off lightly and probably deserved worse. He was escorted from the military complex and found himself standing outside wondering what to do with the rest of his life. His communicator chimed and he saw a message from one of the civilian doctors who had helped with the rescue, and she said the human doctor was awake and asking to speak with him if he was willing. 2 weeks after the crisis ended, Jiwon was finally cleared to leave medical care and return to the sanctuary's hope, and the first thing she did was cry when she saw Minho waiting for her at the airlock. He pulled her into a careful hug and told her she was the bravest and most foolish person he had ever known, and she laughed weakly and said those things were not mutually exclusive. The ship felt strange after everything that had happened, and she found herself missing the cubs even though she knew they were safe with their families now. Captain Minho had his own story to tell about the tribunal he had faced for positioning his ship between the transport and the warship and refusing direct orders to withdraw. The military had wanted to court-martial him, but public opinion had turned him into a hero, and the brass had ultimately decided that giving him a medal was better politics than punishing him. He showed Ji-won the commendation, and she saw that it specifically cited his defense of human values in the face of protocol, and she felt a complicated mix of pride and exhaustion. The news networks had been relentless in their coverage, and Ji-won's face was now recognized across multiple species territories, and she found she hated the attention. She had not done what she did for recognition or glory, but because it was the only choice she could live with, and all the medals and interviews in the world felt hollow compared to the simple gratitude in Hyunwoo's eyes when he had thanked her. Minho understood without her having to explain, and he made sure that no reporters were allowed anywhere near the ship. Messages flooded in from across the galaxy, and Ji-won tried to read them all but gave up after the first 100. There were thank you notes from Veltharine, families whose cubs she had saved, and angry messages from people who thought she had overstepped and endangered human-alien relations, and marriage proposals from strangers who had decided she was some kind of hero. She deleted most of them and kept only the ones from the cubs themselves, because those felt real in a way nothing else did. Hyunwoo sent daily updates about his recovery and about helping the younger cubs adjust to being back with their extended families. Sora sent drawings that showed increasingly creative interpretations of their time on the transport, and Sunhee sent a video of herself practicing grooming techniques on her older cousin while explaining that she needed to stay in practice for when she saw Strange Mother again. Even Yoonji sent a short message that just said, "Thank you," and that she was sorry for being difficult, and Ji-won felt her throat tighten as she recorded responses to each of them. The political fallout was still unfolding, and Ji-won watched news reports about how Veltharin society was having intense debates about their quarantine protocols and whether rigid adherence to rules had almost caused them to commit an unforgivable act. There were calls for reform and new medical guidelines, and suddenly, xenopediatric medicine was getting attention and funding that had never existed before. Human-Veltharin relations warmed dramatically, and trade negotiations that had been stalled for years suddenly resolved themselves. Ji-won received official notification that she was being awarded the Galactic Medical Corps' highest honor, and that there would be a ceremony on Earth in 3 months. She also received notification that there was a formal request from the Veltharin government for her to accept an honorary position in their medical system, and that the Cubs had filed paperwork to formally adopt her as kin of choice, which was apparently a very rare thing in their culture. She had to read that message 3 times before she believed it was real. She finally made time to contact her brother Daehyun, and his face appeared on the screen already crying before she even said hello. He had gotten her final message and had spent days thinking she was dead before the news broke about the rescue, and he told her in a shaking voice that she was never allowed to scare him like that again. Ji-won promised she would try, but they both knew it was not a promise she could really keep, because this was who she was, and they both accepted that. Daehyun showed her the news coverage from Earth and how humans were celebrating her as an example of humanity's best qualities, and how there were already children dressing up as her for costume parties. Ji-won felt deeply uncomfortable with the idea of being turned into some kind of symbol, but Daehyun said she should get used to it, because what she had done mattered to people. She asked him if he understood why she had made the choice she did, and he said, of course, because he was her brother, and he knew she had never been able to walk away from someone who needed help. The weeks turned into months, and Ji-won slowly recovered her strength and went through the mandatory psychological evaluations and physical therapy. The medical team kept saying she was lucky to be alive given how much blood she had lost, and she kept thinking that luck had nothing to do with it, because Minho had refused to leave and civilian doctors had defied their own military to come help. She had been one person making a choice, but the survival of those cubs had required dozens of people making similar choices, and that felt important somehow. The ceremony on Earth was overwhelming, and Ji-won stood on a stage in front of thousands of people while officials gave speeches about courage and compassion and duty. The Veltharin ambassador presented her with a crystal sculpture that was apparently a priceless artifact in the human. Officials gave her medals and certificates, and she smiled and thanked everyone while wishing desperately that she could just go back to work. The only moment that felt genuine was when they surprised her by bringing Hyunwoo and Sora and Yoonji and Sunhee to the ceremony via hologram, and the cubs appeared on stage next to her. The four of them had prepared a statement, and Hyunwoo read it while the others stood solemnly beside him. He said that Jiwon had taught them that family was not about blood or species but about choice, and that when no one else in the galaxy would help them, she had chosen to try. Sora added that Strange Mother had taken off her helmet and given her own blood and nearly died because she believed cubs were worth saving. Yoonji said that she had been wrong to distrust humans and that Jiwon had proven that honor and compassion were not species-specific traits. Sunhee just said she loved her Strange Mother and wanted her to come visit. The audience erupted in applause and Jiwon felt tears streaming down her face, and she managed to say that the cubs had saved her as much as she had saved them, because they had reminded her why she became a doctor in the first place. The ceremony continued, but Jiwon barely remembered the rest of it because she was too busy talking to the cubs through the hologram and promising that yes, she would come visit as soon as she was allowed. After all the ceremonies and interviews and official obligations were finally over, Jiwon received her new assignment options. She could take a prestigious position at the best hospital on Earth with a huge salary and no danger, or she could request a transfer to any ship or station she wanted. Mingo told her that if she wanted to stay on the Sanctuary's hoped there would always be a place for her, but he would understand if she wanted something safer after everything that had happened. Jiwon sat in her quarters and thought about what she wanted and realized that the answer had not changed. She requested assignment to a new medical frigate that was being deployed to the furthest edge of explored space where there were colonies and outposts that rarely saw proper medical care. Minho looked at her request and sighed and said he should have known she would pick the most difficult option, but he would approve it because clearly she had not learned anything about self-preservation. The day before she was scheduled to transfer to her new ship, Jiwon received a package from Velthar in space, and inside was a collection of 197 video messages. She opened the first one and saw a cub she had treated but whose name she had never learned, and he introduced himself as Minsuk and said he was 8 years old and he wanted to say thank you for saving his life. The next message was from another cub named Kyungmi, who was 6, and she showed off a drawing of a human in a medical uniform surrounded by stars. Jiwon watched all 197 messages over the course of several hours, and by the end she was crying and laughing and feeling more connected to those children than she had to most humans she knew. The final message was from all of them together, and they had organized themselves into a massive group, and they chanted her name in harmony while performing something that looked like a traditional ceremony. Hyunwoo stepped forward at the end and spoke for everyone and said that they chose her as family and that the bond would last their entire lives. He said that she had taught them that sometimes the right choice was the hard choice, and that when systems failed, it took individuals to stand up and do what needed to be done. He said that all 197 of them were alive because one human had refused to break, and that they would carry that lesson forward into whatever they became. The message ended with all the cubs raising their paws in a gesture that Jiwon's translator said meant eternal gratitude and family bond. She sat in the quiet of her quarters holding the communication device and thinking about paths not taken and choices that defined who someone was. She could have followed orders and stayed on the Sanctuary's hope and let those cubs die, and she would have been safe and commended for her professionalism. Instead, she had chosen. The chamber floated in space above a world that belonged to no one, and inside that chamber sat representatives from 12 different species who had learned long ago that talking prevented dying, and Daehyun Kim sat among them wearing the simple gray uniform of Earth's diplomatic corps, while his aide, Jiwoo Park, stood behind him with a tablet full of numbers and treaties that nobody would read today because something unprecedented was happening, something that made even the ancient species shift uncomfortably in their seats and whisper among themselves in languages that sounded like wind through crystals or drums in deep water, and that something was the arrival of the Vorlathi, who never left their homeworld anymore, who had stopped caring about galactic politics 3,000 years ago when they developed the ability to see through time itself and realized that most of what happens doesn't matter in the long run, but apparently something mattered now because their ship had appeared without warning and requested an emergency session. And now Daehyun watched as the doors opened and 3 figures entered, who looked almost human except their eyes were too large and completely black like pools of ink. and they moved with the careful deliberation of people who had already seen this moment 1,000 times and were simply going through the motions of making it real. The eldest of the three Vorlathi was named Thessian according to the translation matrix, though Jiwoo whispered that the actual name took 17 syllables and referenced a star that had died before humans discovered fire, and Thessian walked to the center of the circular chamber, where a platform waited for speakers, and every representative leaned forward because the Vorlathi had not addressed the council in living memory, not even when the Krell had tried to claim the mineral-rich asteroid fields near Vorlathi space, not even when the Great Plague swept through 4 systems and killed billions, not even when humanity had first arrived in faster-than-light ships and demanded recognition as a spacefaring species. So whatever brought them here today carried weight that made planets feel light. Thessian spoke in a voice that bypassed the translation matrix entirely, and simply appeared in everyone's mind like a memory they had always possessed, saying that he had seen the threads of fate converging on a point that would reshape the galaxy, that he had watched futures branch and collapse and reform around a single event that approached with mathematical certainty, that the youngest species sat in danger so profound that even 3,000 years of careful neutrality could not prevent him from speaking, and Daehyun felt his stomach tighten because he understood immediately that youngest species meant humanity, meant Earth, meant the colonies that now stretched across 17 systems and held 6 billion human souls who thought they were safe under the Council's protection. The Krell ambassador rose from his seat, making sounds like grinding stones, his forearms gesturing in what the translation matrix labeled as emphatic denial before accusation is made. But Thessian simply turned those black eyes toward the insectoid diplomat and continued speaking, saying that the Krell Dominion had already decided to strike at humanity's agricultural colony, called New Sol, that 47 warships were already being supplied and crewed, that the attack would come within 30 standard rotations, that 2 million humans would die in fire from orbit, because the Krell High Command believed that humanity's rapid technological advancement threatened the established order of species, who had held power for millennia, and the chamber erupted into chaos with half the representatives shouting for proof, while the other half demanded immediate investigation. And through it all, Daehyun sat perfectly still because his military training taught him to recognize truth delivered without emotion, and everything in Thessian's voice carried the flat certainty of someone reporting history, rather than prediction. The Krell ambassador was screaming now about ancient laws against precognitive testimony, about how the Vorlathi had no evidence beyond visions that could mean anything, about how this insult would not stand unanswered. And Daehyun noted with cold precision that the ambassador never actually denied the accusation, never said we would never attack New Sol, never offered to allow inspectors into Krell space, and that omission told him everything he needed to know about what waited in the darkness between stars. But then Thessian did something that changed everything, turning away from the council to look directly at Daehyun with those eyes that had seen futures collapse into present moments. And when he spoke again, his words bypassed the translation entirely and arrived in Daehyun's mind with the force of prophecy. Human, hear my warning well, because your species does not yet understand its own nature, and that ignorance will shape everything that follows. Thessian said inside Daehyun's thoughts while the council chamber faded to insignificance around them. I have seen 17,000 futures that branch from this moment, and in all but 7 of them your colony burns. But what happens after varies wildly depending on a single choice that you will make in the next 30 days. And that choice is whether humanity strikes first against the Krell before they can launch their attack. Daehyun wanted to ask obvious questions about preemptive strikes and defensive war and proportional response, but Thessian continued speaking with the patience of someone who had already heard every question and answer, saying, if you strike first, if you send your fleets to Krell space before they attack, if you destroy their ships while they sit in dock preparing for war, then something will awaken in your species that has slept since you left your homeworld, and you will not stop. Not when the Krell surrender, not when the Council demands peace, not until every Krell world is ash, or until humanity exhausts itself in a war that consumes generations, because humans possess a capacity for sustained total warfare that even you do not comprehend, a refusal to accept defeat that borders on insanity from the perspective of every other species. And if that capacity awakens through offensive action rather than defense, it will burn through the galaxy like fire through dry timber. The vision released Daehyun back into the council chamber, where only seconds had passed. where Jiwoo still stood behind him unaware that he had just received prophecy, where the Krell ambassador continued demanding that the Vorlathi be censured for their interference, and Daehyun raised his hand for recognition and waited for the chamber to quiet before speaking in the measured tones that had carried him through 3 decades of military service and 2 decades of diplomatic posting, saying that Earth would of course cooperate with any council investigation, that humanity welcomed inspectors to verify the Krell's peaceful intentions, that surely this misunderstanding could be resolved through established channels, and he watched the other ambassadors nod approvingly at his reasonable response while inside his mind he was already calculating defense, deployments and fleet movements and wondering if 30 days would be enough time to evacuate 2 million civilians after. The session ended. Jiwoo followed him through corridors that curved with the station's rotation, asking questions that he only half heard about protocol and response options, and whether they should contact Earth immediately. And finally he stopped and turned to face her and saw in her young, idealistic face everything that humanity wanted to believe about itself. That they were peaceful, that they played by rules, that violence was always the last resort, and he realized that Thessian had seen something in human nature that humans themselves had not yet confronted. Something that slept in their genes like a coiled spring waiting for the right pressure to release. "Contact Admiral Minho," Daehyun said quietly while station traffic flowed around them like water around stones. "Tell him to quietly reinforce New Seoul's defenses but make it look like a routine rotation. And get Hyerin to start monitoring all Krell communication channels for any signs of fleet movement. And do it all through back channels because if the council thinks we're preparing for war, they'll tie us up in committees until it's too late." Jiwoo's face showed confusion mixed with fear, because she had joined diplomatic service to prevent wars, not prepare for them, and she asked the question that would haunt them both in the months to come, asking, "Do you really believe the Vorlathi? Do you think the Krell would actually attack us without provocation?" And Daehyun thought about Thessian's black eyes that had seen 17,000 futures, thought about the Krell ambassador who never denied the accusation, thought about the hard truth that species who had ruled for millennia might see humanity's growth as threat rather than promise, and he answered with the only honesty that mattered. "I believe that if we're wrong, we waste some resources on extra defenses. But if we're right and do nothing, 2 million people die, and I'm not willing to take that bet," he said, and then walked toward the communication center to begin making calls that would either save a colony or start humanity down a path that even a 3,000-year-old prophet feared to fully describe. Sun Woo-han stood on the observation deck of New Seoul's Central Administration Tower, watching the third moon rise over endless fields of engineered wheat that fed 40 human worlds, and his daughter Minji pressed her face against the transparent aluminum, asking if the pretty lights in orbit were more supply ships. And he smiled without answering because those lights were Admiral Minho's reinforcement fleet that had arrived 3 days ago under the pretense of routine exercises. And his wife Yujin gave him that look she always gave when he kept secrets for everyone's good. The look that said she knew something was wrong but trusted him to handle it, and he wished desperately that he could evacuate everyone right now, load every ship with civilians and send them to safety. But Daehyun's orders had been explicit. No mass evacuation because that would confirm suspicions and potentially trigger the attack they hoped to prevent. So instead they had quietly staged emergency supplies, pre-positioned evacuation shuttles, and increased the shield generator output to maximum sustainable levels, while telling everyone it was just maintenance and drills. Captain Yuna Song sat in the command chair of the patrol ship Defender running diagnostics for the 4th time that shift because idle hands made her nervous, and something in the Admiral's briefing yesterday had carried undertones that made every instinct she had developed over 15 years of service scream warnings into the void, and her tactical officer Kyung-hee kept glancing at the long-range sensors with the intensity of someone expecting ghosts. And maybe they both were crazy. Maybe the stress of enhanced readiness drills was making them see threats in empty space. But then the sensor board lit up with contact signatures that materialized from hyperspace, in a formation that no merchant convoy would ever use, and Yuna's training took over before conscious thought could interfere, her hand slapping the general alarm while her voice carried across all frequencies saying, "Hostile contacts, all ships to battle stations, this is not a drill." 50 Krell warships dropped into normal space at the system's edge in a formation designed for planetary assault, and their transponders broadcast nothing, No identification codes, no hailing frequencies. Just the electromagnetic silence of predators who had already decided their prey was dead. And aboard the lead Krell vessel, the fleet commander, whose name, translated roughly to stone that crushes, reviewed targeting data for New Sol's population centers with the satisfaction of someone performing a necessary task, because the humans had to learn their place, had to understand that species who evolved yesterday did not dictate terms to civilizations that had ruled for millennia. And if teaching that lesson required killing a few million primitives, then such was the price of maintaining. Order Yuna's 8 patrol ships accelerated toward the Krell fleet, knowing that mathematics made their survival impossible, but also knowing that every minute they bought was another 1,000 civilians reaching evacuation shuttles. And she opened a channel to her small squadron saying, "Today we find out what we're made of. Make every shot count. Make them pay for every meter. And if we're lucky, maybe we'll slow them down enough for the civilians to get clear." And then there was no more time for words, because the Krell fleet had launched missiles that turned space into a geometry problem where the only solution was death. Ji-hoon Kang ran through the underground maintenance tunnels toward Generator Station 3, where alarms screamed that the shield grid was already taking hits from long-range Krell bombardment, and his assistant Borum shouted over the noise that the system was never designed for this kind of sustained fire, that the capacitors would overload in 17 minutes at current draw, and Ji-hoon started rerouting power from the residential sectors because dead civilians didn't need electricity, while living ones desperately needed shields. And his hands moved across the control interface with the precision of 20 years maintaining these generators, bypassing safety protocols that existed to prevent exactly what he was doing, pushing the system past rated capacity into the red zone where equipment either performed miracles or exploded. Admiral Minho watched the tactical display aboard his flagship Indomitable, while his fleet of 30 warships accelerated toward New Sol at maximum burn, knowing they would arrive too late, knowing that Yuna's patrol squadron was already dying to buy time he couldn't give back, and his tactical officer, Commander Taejin, reported that the Krell had committed their entire assault fleet, which meant they intended to make New Sol a lesson written in fire. And Minho gave orders to prepare for fleet engagement, while simultaneously directing every transport within 3 systems to converge on New Sol for evacuation, because if they couldn't prevent the attack, maybe they could at least save some of the people. Sun Wu evacuated the administration tower when the first kinetic strikes hit the northern continent, herding his family into a shuttle that was already overloaded with terrified colonists who pressed against each other, while children cried and adults tried to maintain calm through expressions that fooled nobody. And Yujin held Minji close while asking where the defense fleet was, why nobody was stopping this, and Sun Wu explained through a throat tight with fear that Captain Yuna's squadron was buying them time, that Admiral Minho was coming, that they just needed to survive long enough for help to arrive. And then the shuttle lifted off, and through the viewport he watched his city, the place where he had served as administrator for 12 years, the place where Minji had been born, the place that 4 million people called home, and he watched it burn. Yuna's ship defender died with honor, taking a Krell destroyer with it. Her final act ramming the damaged enemy vessel after her weapons ran dry, and her engines screamed past safety limits, and her last transmission reached every ship in the system saying, "Tell Earth they were right, the monsters are real. Make them pay for this." And then there was light and heat and the mathematical certainty of hull breach at combat velocity, and of her original squadron of 8 patrol ships, only 2 remained operational, while the Krell fleet advanced toward New Sol with barely diminished strength. The shields held for 17 minutes, exactly as Ji-hoon had calculated, before the generators overheated beyond any possibility of recovery. And in those 17 minutes, 60% of New Sol's population reached evacuation shuttles or emergency bunkers, which meant approximately 2,400,000 civilians still remained exposed when the shields collapsed, and Krell kinetic bombardment began in earnest. And Ji-hoon stayed at his post trying to restore power, refusing evacuation, working until the administration tower took a direct hit and 1,700 tons of orbital debris traveling at 40,000 kilometers per hour converted his body and Borum's body and everything they had tried to save into superheated plasma. Admiral Minho's fleet arrived to find New Sol burning from pole to pole, the Krell fleet already withdrawing toward hyperspace jump points, and his tactical officer reported 2,400,000 confirmed casualties, with numbers still rising. as search and rescue penetrated the devastation, and Minho gave orders to pursue the Krell fleet, knowing they would escape but needing to do something other than watch his failures scroll across the damage reports. And then his communication officer received a priority transmission from the Krell fleet. A single message boy left behind like an insult carved into a grave marker. The message played on the Indomitable's bridge in the grinding stone voice of Krell Command saying, "This is the price of expansion. Remain within your designated space or more colonies will burn. Humanity has been warned." And then it self-destructed, and Commander Tajin asked quietly what their orders were. Whether they should return to Earth, whether they should begin search and rescue, and Admiral Minho looked at the tactical display showing New Sol's ruined surface and felt something cold and hard crystallize in his chest. Something that had slept through 30 years of military service, and he realized with perfect clarity what the Vorlathi prophet had tried to warn them about. Sunwoo's shuttle reached orbit to find Admiral Minho's fleet forming up for system defense. And through the viewport he could see New Sol burning below. See the scars where kinetic strikes had carved canyons into continents. See the cities he had administered reduced to craters still glowing with residual heat. And Minji asked why the planet looked different, why everything was red. And he had no answer that a 7-year-old could understand. No way to explain that her home was gone, that her school was gone. The 2 million people, including her best friend's family, were gone. And Eugene wept silently while holding their daughter close. And all around them in the crowded shuttle other families confronted the same loss. The news reached Earth 3 hours later, traveling through quantum-entangled communication relays that connected all human worlds. And Daehyun received it in the council chambers where he had been arguing for sanctions against the Krell. And he read the casualty estimates and the refugee counts and the message the Krell had left behind. And something in his expression made the other ambassadors stop talking, made Jiwoo reach for his arm in concern, made even the Krell ambassador shift. Earth's War Council convened in Geneva 3 days after New Sol burned, and every member arrived already knowing what decision they would make, because the images from the refugee ships had played on every screen across every human world. Images of Sunwoo holding his daughter while she asked when they could go home. Images of the mass graves being dug on the evacuation stations. Images of the scars carved into New Sol's surface visible from orbit. And Fleet Commander Ha-Jun Nam presented the military's recommendation, which was simple enough that even civilians could understand. Complete dismantling of Krell military capability across all 40 of their star systems. And when the civilian oversight representative asked about proportional response, Ha-Jun replied that proportionality died with 2,400,000 colonists. Galactic Council expected humanity to follow established patterns because that's what civilized species did when attacked. They would file formal complaints, present evidence to the tribunal, accept mediation, and eventually receive reparations or sanctions against the aggressor. And the whole process would take years while diplomats argued about precedent and jurisdiction and appropriate penalties. But what the Council didn't understand was that humans had spent 10,000 years perfecting warfare in an environment where losing meant extinction, where every conflict carried existential stakes, where the only species available to fight was each other. And that kind of evolutionary pressure created something unique in the galaxy, something the Krell were about to discover. Commander Ha-Jun's first fleet hit the Krell industrial world of Torvac 7 6 days after New Sol burned, not with a surgical strike designed to minimize casualties, not with warnings or demands for surrender, but with a systematic bombardment of every shipyard, every weapons facility, every manufacturing center capable of producing military hardware. And when the Krell garrison tried to engage, they found human warships that fought with a coordination born from centuries of total war against themselves, ships that used tactics developed in conflicts where losing meant your entire civilization disappeared. And the battle lasted 3 hours before the Krell defenders broke and ran, while Ha-Jun's fleet completed their mission of turning Torvac 7's military infrastructure into radioactive craters. General So Min Yoon's Marines landed on the Krell fortress world of Drac 9 not to occupy but to demonstrate, dropping from orbit in assault pods that carved through defensive fire with the inevitability of mathematics, and her troops moved through Krell defensive positions with a precision that terrified the defenders, because humans fought like they expected to die but refused to stop. And when the fortress commander finally surrendered expecting execution or enslavement, Soman's response shocked him more than defeat. She offered medical care for wounded Krell soldiers, and guaranteed safety for civilians while her engineers systematically demolished every weapons battery and military installation. And the fortress commander asked why humans showed mercy after New Sol. And Soman replied, "We're not here to kill Krell. We're here to make sure you can never kill us." The Krell High Command ordered their main fleet to engage the human invaders, expecting a conventional fleet battle where superior numbers would prevail. But Commander Hajun refused to fight on Krell terms. Instead, his ships scattered across multiple systems, forcing the Krell to divide their forces. And every time the Krell concentrated for battle, the human fleet withdrew. But every time the Krell moved to protect their industrial worlds, human ships appeared and destroyed another shipyard, another weapons factory, another supply depot. And after 2 months of this, the Krell fleet was still intact, but their ability to replace losses was being systematically erased. Taiwan Park sat in a communication center on the human carrier Relentless, composing messages that would reach every Krell world through channels that bypassed their government censorship, and his broadcasts were masterpieces of psychological warfare saying, "Your leaders chose this war when they burned New Sol. Every factory we destroy is their choice. Every shipyard we disable is their choice. And we will keep coming until they cannot threaten anyone again. But your civilians are safe, your homes are safe. Your children are safe if you don't fight because we're not the Krell. We don't murder civilians from orbit." And the effect was exactly what he calculated. Krell worlds began questioning their government, began asking why they should die for leaders who started a war by massacring human colonists. Correspondent Yunji Cho traveled with the Third Fleet, sending reports back to Earth and the galactic networks, showing the reality of the human offensive. And what she showed was not the genocide that Council species feared, but something almost more disturbing. A species that fought with absolute determination while maintaining precise control. Marines who would die holding defensive positions but never fired on civilians. Fleet commanders who destroyed military targets with surgical precision while avoiding population centers. And engineers who arrived behind the combat troops to help rebuild civilian infrastructure, even as the war continued. And her reports forced the galaxy to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity wasn't becoming the monsters. They were becoming something worse for their enemies. They were becoming unstoppable. The Krell sued for peace after 6 months, offering territorial concessions and reparations, and the Galactic Council rushed to mediate, expecting humanity would accept, because 6 months of warfare had cost Earth's economy dearly, and public support for continued fighting was surely weakening. But Ambassador Daehyun's response reached the council chambers with all the warmth of vacuum, saying the Krell will surrender completely and accept full dismantling of their military capability, or we will continue operations indefinitely. And the council representative tried to argue that such terms were unreasonable, that the Krell had suffered enough, that continuing the war served no purpose. And Daehyun replied, "You said the same thing after New Sol burned, that we had suffered enough, that seeking justice served no purpose. Where was the council when 2 million humans died? Where was galactic law when the Krell attacked without provocation? And now that we're winning, you suddenly care about proportionality?" General Soman's Marines pushed deeper into Krell space, taking one fortress world after another. And the pattern was always the same. Fierce resistance followed by surrender, followed by humane treatment and systematic dismantling of military infrastructure. And Krell soldiers began surrendering more quickly because they learned that humans kept their promises, that wounded prisoners received medical care, that civilians were protected, that the humans were serious about only destroying military capability. And this somehow made the defeats worse because the Krell had expected barbarians who could be fought with barbarian tactics. But instead they faced an enemy who fought with precision and mercy in equal measure. Commander Hajun's fleet reached the Krell core systems after 8 months, and the defenders fought desperately because these were the heart worlds where Krell civilization had been born, and the battles were fierce with both sides taking heavy casualties. But the mathematics were inevitable. Humans had mobilized their economy for total war, while the Krell industrial base was already shattered. Humans could replace ships and crews while the Krell could not. And most importantly, humans showed no sign of stopping. No war weariness, no protests demanding peace. Just a grinding determination to finish what had been started. The Krell attempted one desperate gamble, organizing their remaining fleet for a strike against Earth itself, hoping to make humans feel the same terror that New Sol had experienced, hoping to break the will that seemed unbreakable. and they gathered every operational warship from every system, more than 200 vessels, and they jumped toward the Sol system believing that surely humanity would negotiate if their homeworld was threatened. But they didn't understand that threatening Earth wouldn't make humans stop. It would make them angry. And angry humans were already dismantling the Krell Empire world. By World Admiral Minho commanded the Sol System Defense Fleet, and his sensors detected the Krell Task Force when it entered the outer system. And he had been waiting for this, knowing it would come, knowing that cornered enemies always struck at what they thought was weakness, and his fleet moved to intercept with the cold efficiency of people defending their home. And the battle lasted 7 hours with the Krell throwing everything they had against Earth's defenses. And when it was over, not a single Krell ship escaped. Every vessel was destroyed or disabled. And Minho broadcast images of the wreckage to every Krell world saying, "You tried to make us feel what you made New Sol feel. Instead, you've demonstrated why you can never win this war." Taewon's psychological warfare reached its peak after the failed Earth assault. His broadcast to Krell worlds showing the destroyed task force, showing the futility of continued resistance, saying, "Your government has now lost over 400 warships trying to fight humanity. Your industrial base is shattered. Your colonies are undefended, and we're still coming every day we come. Every day we take another system, another shipyard, another fortress, and we will never stop until you cannot threaten anyone again." And Krell morale collapsed across entire sectors.